Good morning, everyone. Want to talk to you this morning about research numbers and how we get that data and where it comes from. The research reporting group is part of Sponsored Research Services now. I have another person that helps me pulling information and preparing reports, Keely Dunn, who's senior data analyst. So I couldn't do everything that we do without her help also. So let's get started. You know, we get a lot of questions about our research numbers. What are they? Are we going to go up this year? How do we compare to other institutions? And the famous research administration answer is, well, it depends. So as a comparison, we have a chart here for last year's numbers. Fiscal 22 is the most recent actual release reports that we have on the research expenditures. And depending on what you're looking for, you can get a variety of numbers to make up what's research expenditures. So just as comparison, the first little number for TAMU annual financial report, just the university alone, we had 255 million in the annual financial report for research. Now, if you take the campus annual financial reports and go ahead and include A&M plus the agencies like TEAS, AgriLife, Health Science Center, Galveston, System Office, Forest Service, TVMDL, Shared Services, TTI, you come up to 892 million. If we also take that number and add in the Research Foundation with it, we're up to 965 million. Another source of our research numbers are reports that we do each year for the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board. And if you take all the system members, including regionals, we're up to 1.2 billion. The coordinating board also we track how much did A&M plus the agencies report. We have 924 million. If we take the coordinating board numbers plus add in HSC and Galveston, because they are separate academic institutions that report separately to coordinating board, we're up to 1.1 billion. And then the final number, 1.153 or 1.152.7 billion is the official number that we reported for A&M to the National Science Foundation annual survey. We're going to talk some about that. That's kind of our standard number that we put out in public for how did we do. This just shows you a little bit more of a written explanation of what went into each of those numbers on the chart. So what kind of things do we count in research expenditures? Well, obviously, the first big thing is all of our externally funded research grants. We also can count what's called research training grants. So if you're training individuals in the research methods and processes, we can count those types of grants. Anything that's considered cost sharing for a sponsored agreement or research project, we include that. Equipment that's bought on projects is certainly counted. However, we don't count the cost of land or building new buildings in our research numbers. Those will get reported on another survey to the National Science Foundation. We report research gifts, startup money, bridge funding, seed funds for faculty are counted. We have internally funded grants programs. In fact, you probably heard recently that a new program announced by the BPR office called Ascend. There's another one called the ADM, Advancing Discovery to Market, and the RDF fund. Those are examples of internal grant programs that are counted. Any indirect cost that's earned on a grant or contract is counted as a research expenditure. We also have tuition and fees that are for students that are working on research projects, And we even count in the National Science Foundation survey tuition waivers, which we have to get information from the Compass system. And the external survey to NSF also allows us to count what we call unrecovered indirect. So if we have projects that are not earning the full amount of indirect cost, we can take the value of the difference between what we should have earned at the full rate and what we actually earn, and that can be counted as part of our research expenditures. Let me just talk a little bit about cost sharing. We have projects where cost sharing is proposed. Sometimes it's even possibly required. And in order for us to count cost sharing expenses related to research, they have to be recorded in the accounting system. Most often, a lot of the cost sharing that happens will be a percent of the researcher's time, which ends up having to be put in a separate, what we call a support account, in order to track those expenditures. It is required, if we're going to count cost sharing, it must be recorded in our accounting system. And we do track it to the sponsored project or to the grant or contract level. Now, we do have some guidelines about what we cannot count in our research expenditure numbers. And these are very specific by our guidelines for the NSF survey that we participate in annually. We don't count public service projects or outreach programs. Even though they're a grant or contract, we cannot count them if they're not for research. Curriculum development, not counted unless it's part of an overall research project. If we have R&D by university faculty that may be affiliated with another outside institution or hospital, we cannot count those unless they're actually expenditures recorded in our accounting system. We can't just estimate a portion of time that's spent on research, say out of the instruction budget. We have to actually have expenditures recorded on accounts that are coded research. I mentioned that we cannot count capital projects such as building new buildings, major renovations of research facilities. We have another survey that our office handles every other year to the National Science Foundation that we have to report new facilities, what we're building that relate to research. Any non-research training grants cannot be included. And if you had perhaps a project, we typically don't see this, that the indirect cost rate was in excess of your standard federally negotiated rate, we would only be able to include just the indirect cost amount that was in line with our standard approved rate. So I talk about that I've mentioned the NSF HERD survey, which stands for Higher Education R&D Survey. This is an annual survey. It is a very important survey that we've been participating in for many years. The U.S. universities participate in it. When I say all, it is a voluntary survey, but if you receive ranking in the country, you obviously have to participate in the survey. The Maestro system has very graciously, they've worked on a program several years ago and we're using it. It's an automated report where we can combine TAMU, Galveston, HSC, all of the agencies into a combined report so that we can use that to complete our NSF HERD survey. And let me just clarify, when I say it's an NSF survey, we're reporting more on the survey. We're reporting all research expenditures, not just those that are funded by the National Science Foundation. They happen to be the organization that is capturing all this data for universities. Another survey that's statewide, and this is required by the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board, is a survey due in December called the Sources and Uses. And that report is used to help determine allocations of state funding. So I want to talk more about the NSF herd survey. It determines our national ranking with TAMU, and we obviously add in the agency amounts as part of our number. And this is really considered our benchmark with other U.S. institutions. So when we give out a number for TAMU research, we typically always want to just use the NSF survey amount. The latest rankings that we have were based on fiscal 21 data. I know it seems like we're a year behind, but they do not release, NSF does not release the rankings. For example, for fiscal 22, which has already passed, and we're about to finish fiscal 23, they will not release rankings until late fall. So the latest rankings from 21, there were over 900 institutions in the U.S. that participated, and you have to have at least 150,000 in expenditures. And the rankings went from 150,000 all the way up to 3.18 billion. So when you look back historically at how A&M has done in the rankings, you go back up until 1998, we were in the top 10 all the time. And let me just say the NSF survey, the tracking of these numbers since 1972 that we've been participating in that survey. We've been in the top 20 several times, 1999 to 2002, 2008 to 2010, 2014 to 2018, and then 20 to 2021. So we are currently ranked number 16 in the country in our R&D expenditures. And one thing that really has helped our numbers and ranking is that in fiscal 2013, we began including the Health Science Center as well as the Galveston campus. Prior to 2013, HSC was reporting separately to the National Science Foundation. So this has really helped our research numbers tremendously. The NSF's herd survey form, which is prepared by our group, by me and Keely Dunn, is a long survey, and it's 32 pages long. And let me just back up. When I said Keely and I prepare it, yes, we're part of who prepares it, but there are people that work on these numbers at every single one of our agencies that make up what we say is the TAMU number. So it's not just us. Yes, we have the oversight, but we have got lots of help from members in the agency offices also. NSF says it should only take us 64 hours. That's kind of an underestimate since we're combining multiple system members in order to come up with the TAMU number. We have to track our numbers by what's the source of the funding: federal, state of Texas, business, nonprofits, institutional funds, and other universities and foreign. So another question is foreign expenditures. They want to know, what did we spend from foreign sponsors every year? How much of our money is contract versus grant expenditures? What did our medical school spend? Did we have human clinical trial expenditures? Was our research considered basic, applied, or development? What about subrecipients? Did we have subcontract money received, or who did we pay? How much did we pay out? Another question has to deal with categories of cost: salaries, wages, fringe, equipment, pass-throughs, other indirects, and unrecovered. How much did we spend just on capital equipment by source of funds? We also have a couple of questions that deal with what was our head count? How many researchers do we have on campus? And also how many R&D technicians, support staff? They'd like to know the breakdown of the head count by gender, citizenship, the education level. And then another question, convert the head count to FTE. So it is a very long and complicated survey that we do each year. So when I say TAMU, I want to clarify who all participates. And the campus code is the campus code that's used in FAMIS. Of course, for the university, that's O2, which does include the campus and Cutter, but we also have all the agencies that also do research, AgriLife Research and Extension, TEAS, TTI, the Health Science Center, Galveston campus, the TVMDL, Forest Service, the system office. We have something called shared services. And then, of course, our research foundation, which has been handling basically the IODP program is one of the major things that the RF has handled. So our office does compile all of the numbers that we get that make up all of these members in the system that we call the TAMU research number. The survey that we prepare for NSF is very complex, and if it has become a real great tool that we now have the Maestro system to help us compile the data. All of the system members that were on the previous list are those that are using the Maestro system also in order for us to prepare the report. Maestro also has a built-in calculation for us on the value of the unrecovered indirect cost. We also have a feature that we want to be sure we're not over counting expenditures. So we do have a way to eliminate subcontract activity when it's between other system members. We want to be sure we're not double counting or inflating our numbers to be more than they really should be. We have a feature that we can use with the Compass, a Compass download for tuition waivers for grad students that are working on research accounts or projects. We have some agencies, AgriLife Research and TTI, that receive both state and federal appropriated dollars, and the Maestro application has a provision to help us separate those expenditures out based on a famous, what's called a bank code. I will say that the Maestro report for the NSF report has saved us a lot of time. It's created efficiencies. In former days when I worked on this report, we would receive huge spreadsheets with multiple tabs from all of the agencies and have to sum them up in order to come up with our NSF herd survey amount. So having it programmed has been a great step forward for us. Last year, fiscal 22, of which we're not ranked on yet, but we were at 1.153 billion. And the way that divides out is about 1.1 million is considered what's called science and engineering fields. And the other piece was the non-science and engineering fields for our total of 1.153. This chart tells you a little bit about how the rankings have fallen since 1985. You can see early on, we used to be in the top 10, but as more and more institutions are participating in the NSF herd survey, our ranking has come down somewhat, but we are quite proud that we are still in the top 20. One thing you will notice is that beginning in fiscal 20, we did for the first time achieve over $1 billion in R&D expenditures. And since 2020, we have continued to increase somewhat. When we look at the total from last year, the 1.153 billion, what you'll see is that when we have to allocate according to the source of who gave us the money or the source of the expenditures, that the bulk of the high percentage of our money is from federal sources, either directly from federal agencies or what we consider federal flow through, meaning it originated with a federal sponsor. So 46%, a little over 505 million. The next big piece of our expenditures is from institutional funds. So what I mean by that is the institution funded the research. So within FAMIS, now this is for A&M, our designated fund range, which would be primarily Ledger 2, is where institutional funds reside. We also have quite a bit of our expenditures from state and local government, meaning state appropriations, state grants and contracts. So that's 17%. And you can see the remainder of smaller percentages come from nonprofit sponsors, for-profit or business sponsors, and other would be foreign and other universities. As a comparison between fiscal 21 and 22, we did increase around $5 million. So we do continue to have increases, which is what we like to see. A different way of looking at our expenditures have to do with what we call field of science. So this has to do with the category of the research, and the field of science is something that the National Science Foundation heard survey directions. We have to classify our projects by what scientific field they go with. So for example, you have life sciences is 38% of our expenditures. So that's going to include your biological sciences, your medical sciences, health sciences, agriculture, natural resources, and conservation. And then, of course, another significant part of our expenditures is from engineering fields, 35%. Then, of course, geosciences, which is going to be your ocean, your atmospheric sciences. That's going to, that is a little over 10%. Your physical sciences are going to be your chemistry, your physics, astronomy. There is a category that's considered your non-science and engineering, and NSF classifies things like education, communication, library science, performing arts, public administration, that they consider those fields what they call non-science and engineering. This is just showing you for the last 5 years, how did the expenditures break out numbers according to our fields of science. Now, one of the things that, you know, we do receive, or we do have expenditures on multiple system members that make up our research number. And it's very important that all of the members are participating, and if they have research, that we are getting it reported. So we do caution that when you give out numbers for what did we spend, that we want to report the full 1.153 billion for A&M, and that we not just piece out the agencies separately. We do want to report the total if we're giving out numbers to the public. To tell you what other institutions are ahead of us, I said we were in the top 20. We are number 16 at the moment. We have other institutions. The number one is Johns Hopkins, who has usually been the leader for a number of years due to their applied physics lab, which is associated with the university. Johns Hopkins has been at the top for quite a while. So you can see how we compare to other institutions, which ones are ahead of us. The only other Texas institution right now that's still in the top 20 is MD Anderson in Houston. One thing that's emphasized a lot is how much federal money did we have in expenditures? We're 28 when it comes to federal expenditures. So overall, even though we're at 16, if you rank us by federal funds, we don't make the top 20 right now, but you know, we're always looking for more funding, and this is something that we want to try to increase our federal, but we're not quite there in the top 20 yet. If you are interested in knowing where is our federal money that we do have coming from, last year we had 505 million. Our expenditures were the highest from the National Science Foundation and also from Department of Health and Human Services, which includes the NIH. Our other category has quite a bit of expenditures. And when I say other federal, what that means is U.S. Department of Education, Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, Environmental Protection Agency, Homeland Security, Department of Interior, U.S. Agency for International Development, the Justice Department, the VA, and HUD makes up other. And then also the major agencies include USDA, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and NASA. This slide gives you a picture of what about the entire system for A&M. The entire A&M system, we were at 1.273 billion, and the regional campuses all do report their own numbers separately to National Science Foundation. These statistics are publicly reported on the NSF HERD website, although the rankings, like I said, for 22 are not officially out yet. Out of the 1.274 billion that the system had, the percentages line somewhat with what A&M had. Federal government sources made up 43%, institutional sources 27%, state and local 20%, and then the remainder with nonprofit, business, and other sources. When you look at the entire A&M system, you can see that A&M and the agencies comprise around 90% of our R&D totals, and the regional campuses are around 10%. And this is just a 5-year graphic of how we compared just A&M plus what the regionals contributed. Now I want to focus on Maestro and FAMIS coding. You know, how do we come up with these numbers that we classify as research? And this all has to do with reporting codes, what we call reporting codes that get assigned to R&D projects and to accounts. And these codes are critical for reporting of our expenditures, for awards, for analysis, and other types of data requests that our office receives. Now, on sponsored projects that go through the Maestro system that SRS manages, the PI does have to help put in some of the coding as it relates to their project. Once the proposal is funded and the project is established, SRS will set the project up in Maestro, and reporting codes do get assigned, and these do transfer over to the FAMIS accounting system, and this is what affects our expenditure reports. So on this particular screen, if you were in Maestro and you were looking at a particular PI project, there is a tab under the project module called reporting code. And the major codes that I'm focusing on have to do that says higher ed survey and other reporting codes. And this is where the coding is so critical for what we need when we're preparing R&D surveys. Another part of the reporting code screen, this is a shot further down, is called THECB Special Areas of Interest. Now, these are coordinating board, the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board areas of interest. Not every project will have a special area of interest, but these are needed when we do our annual reports to the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board. So if the research on the project relates to one of these categories, it also needs to be marked. If you were to look in FAMIS, those of you that are familiar with FAMIS screens, screen 9 is called SL Grant and Contract Attributes. And this is where a lot of this coding information is transferred to FAMIS. So you will see things such as the sponsor name on this screen, the name of the project, account number. The coding I have a big red box around are the codes that drive a lot of the questions and the way that we have to organize expenditures for the NSF HERD report. So the first one that you see on the coding string is something called 1A or 1B. And 1A simply means the project is R&D and it will get counted in our surveys for research expenditures. If a project is marked 1B, it means it's not R&D and it could be possibly instruction, public service, academic support, student services, O&M, or scholarship and fellowship. So when we talk about, well, what makes up R&D? The basic definitions would be that R&D or research is simply creative and systematic work undertaken to increase knowledge, whether it's knowledge of humans, culture, society, whereas the development piece means you're going to use the knowledge to help toward the production of useful materials, device systems. Methods include design and development of prototypes. And again, R&D can also include research training of individuals. The science and engineering fields, this is what we have to look to the PI, the researcher, to help determine the area of research that's being done. So the field of science codes are pretty standard as far as they've been the same codes for a number of years. There was a major revision back in 2016 by the National Science Foundation. For example, anthropology became a separate field and was no longer just considered part of sociology. And I mentioned that we have fields that NSF considers to be non-science and engineering, education, law, humanities, visual arts, performing arts, business, communication, social work, library science, public administration. Although they consider it non-science and engineering, these are still expenditures that do get reported in our surveys. Just to give you an example, for science and engineering fields for engineering, you can see that there's a number of categories that have to be further defined as to the type of engineering field. And this is just an example. Some of our other categories, like biological sciences, you're going to have subcategories within each grouping. I mentioned that coordinating board requires something called special areas of interest. And on certain projects that have these fields, they should also be marked, but not every single research project will necessarily have this special area of interest. Things like coordinating board, when I say they want to know, typically it's because some legislation has said, we need an annual report to tell us in the state of Texas how much we're spending on this category. Some of the categories like energy, cancer research, AIDS, biotechnology, human embryonic and adult stem cells, microelectronics, computer technology, are some of the main categories that we do track. Another thing is the type of research being done, what we call the character of the research. We have three categories: basic research, applied research, and development. The basic research is what a lot of our projects are coded, acquiring new knowledge of the underlying foundations of phenomena and observable facts. Whereas applied may be taking that original investigation and you're directing it toward a specific practical aim. And development is focused on producing new products and processes or improving existing products and processes. So in case you're interested in, well, how do you categorize that? Again, we rely on the researcher to help us determine, is the research being done basic, applied, or experimental or development? So I'll just look at one of these that I think is a good example. A researcher is going to study the properties of human blood to determine what's affecting coagulation. that would be considered basic. Now the second level would be applied. They're conducting research on how a new chickenpox vaccine affects blood coagulation. And then the last category of development, they're going to take that information to conduct clinical trials to test a newly developed chickenpox vaccine on young children. So there is a differentiation that we again expect the researcher to help determine, is his research basic, applied, or development. The last category of the reporting codes that has to be completed is the grantor contract. Was it a competitively or peer-reviewed project before, as it was selected? A lot of your federal grant programs are that way. Or the other is, was it just negotiated or other individual, like a lot of fixed price projects with companies are just individually negotiated. They're not a competitive review. So we again have to distinguish the type of selection. There's several other reporting attributes that we ask that they be completed if they apply, such as, is the project related to STEM, helping prepare students in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math? Is it a project where underrepresented students are included? Is it COVID-19 related? Or is it an animal or human clinical trial? Some of these other attributes may not always apply, but again, we're wanting to know this because we do get a lot of questions and sometimes are asked to come up with lists of projects that relate to these particular areas. There are other reporting attributes that are in the FAMIS system, what we call the function of the project, the NACUBO function. When I say NACUBO, this is requirements by the National Association of College and University Business Officers to help you do financial reporting. So in FAMIS, if you see a function code 15, that means the project is research. And typically the majority of the projects that go through SRS are research projects, although sometimes there are other categories such as instruction, public service, scholarships, fellowships, and those have different codes in the FAMIS system. Something that you will note on that screen in FAMIS and also on the reporting code is what's called a CFDA, Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, or the new terminology is Assistance Listing Number, but it's hard to quit calling it CFDA. That means that it's got a federal identifier as to the source of funding. So, for example, if you get a grant from the National Science Foundation, their CFDA numbers always begin with the number 47. Point, and then there's 3 more digits. And that tells you the category of the NSF directorate that awarded the grant. Any account in FAMIS or Maestro that has a CFDA number, which is a 5-digit number assigned, means it's federal funding. It means the source of the money either came directly from the federal agency or it was considered federal flow through. One thing I'd like to mention, especially if you're someone that manages funds, the responsible person on the account or support account in FAMIS, certainly at SRS, the PI name is always put on those a support account level or the main project level, the subledger account. And this also controls whether or not the individual can see their accounts in the Maestro system. Sometimes we get questions such as, I can't see my account. The department will say, this PI cannot see the account. And again, the first thing to check is to say, well, who is the responsible person listed on the account? Because if it's not their name, then it will not appear in their account list in the Maestro system. This slide what I provided you is a link if in case you're really into looking at data. The National Science Foundation does publish the results of their surveys for multiple years on their website, which list institutions and how everyone ranked. The Division of Research has a nice page called Research by the Numbers, which you can use that link to view. And also within the state of Texas, the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board publishes a history of research expenditures by universities on the web link that's given there. So again, if you have questions about reporting, you need a lot of times Keely and I assist with providing data and information, certainly to higher up administrators when there's an interest in particular types of grants that we administer here at SRS. We are here to answer questions. And again, we are the ones that are kind of overseeing these R&D surveys and try to make sure that we check that the coding is correct. And certainly we're here to help and answer questions that you might have dealing with reporting.